Hello, my name is Kimberly Farmer. I'm with Dark Zebra Cybersecurity Training. Thank you so much for joining today's session. Today we'll be talking about Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or more commonly CMMC. But before we go into this topic, a couple of quick housekeeping notes. If you are here for a CEU credit, just stick with me to the end and I'll walk you through exactly how to request that certificate. This can be used for cybersecurity certifications, validation for your CEUs. It's particularly geared towards Security Plus, but there are other cyber certs that this topic could be applicable to. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat and we will get to them at the end if there is time. And if not, I will hopefully be able to get to you after the meeting and just answer your questions. Let's dive in. Here's what we'll be talking about in the next hour. We'll kick off with a quick glossary of terms. Then we'll take a step back and define what CMMC actually is in plain language. And then from there, we'll get into a bit of history and a little bit of why this took so long to actually show up in anyone's contract. CMMC has been around for a while, at least the concept has, but it's not until the last several months actually that it's been implemented. We'll talk about the 3 CMMC levels and the phased rollout timeline, and also talk about some of the real-world challenges that organizations are running into as they're implementing CMMC. After that, we'll cover the guidance documents behind CMMC, including a real-world example of one control from start to finish. So where to go for official resources we'll cover, and also how eMASS fits in. And then finally, I know that several people are familiar with the Risk Management Framework, or RMF, and so we'll talk about how CMMC compares to RMF. And then just as a side note for anyone who's using this as a certificate for a attendance certificate for a CEU, at the back of this slide deck, there's an appendix that talks about how these controls map to Security Plus. Before we get into the history and the details, I want to talk about some quick glossary terms, and these are just a handful of acronyms that we're going to be using a lot today in today's training, and they go around CMMC in general. So just want to make sure that this is commonly understood. FCI is the first acronym. That stands for Federal Contract Information. And this is just basically any information that's tied to a contract that's not meant for public release. So any contract that you hold has FCI part of it, and so just making sure that information is protected. COI is the next definition. That stands for Controlled Unclassified Information. And this is a step up in sensitivity from FCI. And the thing level 2 of CMMC is really built to protect. And we'll talk more about what level 2 is in this training. DIB, or DIB, stands for the Defense Industrial Base. And that's the whole ecosystem of companies, all the way down from huge prime contractors down to small subcontractors that work under Department of Defense or Department of War contracts. The C3PAO is a certified third-party assessment organization. And this is the accredited commercial firms who actually conduct level 2 assessments. DIBCAC is the government's own assessment body, and they handle level 3 CMMC certifications instead of a commercial C3PAO. POEM, or Plan of Action and Milestone, is basically your documented plan to fix a gap by a deadline. So you might have controls that you're not able to meet at this time, but you have a plan to get there, and that is what you put in your POEM. SPURS is the Supplier Performance Risk System, and this is where your self-assessment score and your CMMC status actually gets posted for contracting officers to check. DFARS stands for the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. And this is the acquisition rules that pull all of this into an actual contract. All of CMMC information. And there's many regulations that fall under DFARS, but we'll talk about the specific ones for CMMC in a later slide. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And this is the agency behind many technical publications, but in particular with CMMC, they've published special SP 800-171, and that is the document that the CMMC technical controls are built upon. Just wanted you to keep these in the back of your mind, and we'll use most of them multiple times throughout this training. So what is CMMC exactly? CMMC is the Department of War or Department of Defense's program for verifying, not just trusting, that a defense contractor's cybersecurity actually protects the sensitive information it's been entrusted with. And that word verifying is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and it's the whole reason this program exists. The requirements to protect information, to protect CUI has been in place long before CMMC. Prior to CMMC, it was just reported not through a third party. It was just self-attested how contractors were validating that. So CMMC just added the technical requirements to validate how you're protecting that information. So a few things worth anchoring on before we move on is who CMMC applies to. It applies to any company within the defense industrial base who handles FCI or CUI. Again, that's whether or not you're a large prime subcontractor or just a small 1-person or 5-person subcontractor. What it protects is federal contract information and controlled unclassified information. Those are the 2 sensitivity tiers that we covered in the glossary. But what changed, as I alluded to earlier, is that this system, CMMC, runs on self-attestation. It's instead of the honor system, and now it's independently verifiably assessed. So it used to be run just on the honor system. And under CMMC, there's third parties that validate what contractors are saying, how they're securing their security controls. And how this scales is there isn't one flat bar that everyone has to clear. There are 3 levels that CMMC has been broken down into. And so depending on how sensitive the information is, the CUI that you're protecting and that you're handling, is at what level of a CMMC that the contract is going to be written and issued, to stating at what level this information needs to be protected at. So again, it's levels 1, 2, and 3. And again, we'll go into those details. So with that grounding in place, let's just kind of rewind a little bit and talk about why this program took so long to actually arrive. I first heard about CMMC, and probably many of you did as well, many years ago. I heard about it in 2019, and when I first did, I knew this was going to be big. It had the implications and the potential to impact many organizations, anyone who does business with the Department of Defense. And so I took note, and I was very interested in learning about it and wanted to know where this was headed. But it kept starting and stopping and pausing and not necessarily fully being implemented. And so I kind of stopped paying direct attention to it. We're going to talk about why that took so long to get implemented and where we're at now. Starting in 2017, under DFARS Clause 252, 204, 712, contractors were required to self-attest that they met the requirements of NIST Special Publication 800-171 for controlled unclassified information. But again, at this time, nobody was independently checking. And as a result, multiple reports have found that companies were overstating their compliance and weren't being consistent amongst organizations of how they're implementing these controls, while breaches across the defense industrial base, and I'll add across the world, were continuing to climb. So as a result, in 2019 and 2020, the Department of Defense announced CMMC 1.0, so the first version. And this first version was more complex than the version that we're under now. It initially had 5 different levels that they were hoping that around 7,500 companies would be certified under CMMC by 2021. And that target turned out to be widely optimistic. And the rule itself drew more than 850 public comments, with small contractors raising serious concerns about the cost and just the complexity of having and of implementing CMMC. So as a result, to DoD's credit, they took a pause and went back to the drawing board to look at how they can make this more realistic and more implementable. So that redesign became CMMC 2.0, which was revealed in November of 2021. And 2.0 streamlined the 5 levels down to 3, and that's what we've ended up with now. And they also realigned NIST 800-171 for the security controls of CMMC to align with 800-171. But the part that actually explains the long delay is before CMMC could be fully implemented and implemented at all really officially, there needed to be 2 federal rulemakings to be put in place. And those rules are 32 CFR Part 170, that's CMMC's program rule itself. This rule became final in December of 2024. The other rule that needed to be implemented before CMMC could become a reality was DFAR's Acquisition Rule 252-204-7021. And this is the rule that actually puts CMMC language into contracts. Each rulemaking carries its own OMB review and public comment period. And so that is why the program existed in concept long before we were seeing any contracts being issued and solicitations being put out there with CMMC requirements in them. Okay, so with that behind us, let's talk about what CMMC actually is and what the requirements are today. As I mentioned, there are 3 levels. And you'll notice that the levels have 2 main wordings there. There's the foundational, advanced, and expert in bold there. But underneath that, there's more of a description of what those terms are. And these terms, both the official and the kind of the more layman's terms, both are official terms from the Department of Defense CIO's CMMC site. So official terms here. The first one's foundational, and that's basically safeguarding of FCI, federal contract information. This has 15 practices. It's self-assessed annually, or the requirement you can self-assess, and it's strictly a pass or fail. So there's no allowances for a plan of action and milestone safety net here, as there are in the other 2 levels. So again, the federal contract information is just information about the contract itself that you're holding, that you've been awarded. That's information that's not meant to be publicly released. So anyone who has a contract with the Department of Defense with contracts going forward are going to have to be at least certified at a CMMC level 1. Level 2 is the advanced level. And in more general layman's terms, this is the broad protection of CUI. This is one of the most common levels, and it's the one that most people are going to have to certify to. It's 110 practices. And it's worth remembering that this is taken, the security controls for level 2 are taken directly from NIST Special Publication 800-171, Revision 2. Now, not Revision 3. We'll come back to that distinction later. But depending upon your specific contract, in this level 2, you'll either self-assess or you'll need a certified third-party assessor or a C3 PAO. Level 3 is the expert level, and this is also described as a higher level protection of CUI against advanced persistent threats, or APTs. In this third level, there are 24 more additional requirements from level 2, and these additional requirements are pulled from NIST Special Publication 800-172. Level 3 is reserved for the most sensitive programs, as you would expect at the highest level. And here assessment isn't done by a C3 PAO. It's instead done by the government's own assessors. And that assessment organization is called DIBCAC. Let's look at the phased rollout and where we're at. Phase 1 is where we're currently in. It started in November 10th of 2025. And this is where most contracts are today. It allows for self-assessment in levels 1 and 2 and appearing in solicitations. And let me correct myself, I said most contracts meant most contracts that are being issued and being solicited today have some CMMC language around phase 1. But here's kind of the thing to footnote here. Phase 2 starts November 10th, 2026. So that's only about 4 months from today. And today it's July of 2026 for anyone listening later. And that's the moment that level 2 third-party certification going through a C3 PAO stops being optional for contracts involving CUI. So right now it can be optional. And going through a C3 PAO becomes a condition of award. Phase 3 will start in November of 2027. And as you can see, each of these are just a year from each other. And this is where level 3 government-led assessments become part of contracting language where it's applicable. Phase 4 will follow the year after in November of 2028. And this is where CMMC is in full implementation. So every contract from the Department of Defense that will be reviewed for CMMC requirements, and that will be included in the solicitation language and thus the contract that's being awarded. This also, just want to mention, includes option periods in contracts that were awarded years earlier. So there's some retro look back at contracts with options being exercised. Going back to phase 2, the fact that that's coming in 4 months, that is significant because, as we're going to discuss next, the assessor ecosystem is nowhere near ready for the volume of contractors that need to be certified at that level. These numbers show here that there are far more organizations needing to be certified than there are C3 PAO assessors. As you can see, there are fewer than 100 C3 PAOs in the entire country. And meanwhile, there's somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 contractors that need level 2 certification, or that's projected that are going to need level 2 certification. So that imbalance is exactly why assessment wait times are currently running 4 to 8 months. And it's only going to get worse as we head closer to phase 2 and beyond. Another stat that's worth sitting on for a minute is only about a quarter of contractors are actually ready to be certified when they show up for their C3 PAO assessment. And so that's just compounding the capacity problem because assessors are spending scarce appointment slots on companies that end up getting sent back to fix gaps instead of walking away certified. But it's understandable, it's part of the process, as you are going to get certified, there's a learning curve, and you might not know and think you might be hitting them. The C3PAO assessor can help you see where your gaps are and know you're not quite ready. Just one more final data point on this chart is just a 2026 GAO report flagged some real structural risk here. There's concerns about the assessor capacity, that the possibility that smaller contractors simply leave the defense industrial base rather than paying for the certification. They're saying, I'm just going to go after different work. I'm not going to go after defense work. And so the worry there is that the Department of Defense might lean on waivers if the ecosystem can't keep up, which would undercut the entire point of CMMC as a verification program. So this is kind of the scope and the scale of the problem. But let's talk a little bit about where organizations go wrong, or where some of the challenges are, about additional challenges of implementing CMMC. First is cost. As you'd expect, and as an organization wanting to be getting to certification, that's going to be one of your first questions. How much could this cost me? This cost is not necessarily distributed evenly. And level 2 runs anywhere from $50,000 to $300,000 or more. And per employee, small contractors are paying $2,500 to $4,600 compared to $600 to $1,000 for large primes. So they're the same 110 controls in level 2. Regardless of the size of your organization, you're held to the same standard of meeting those controls. The Department of Defense did acknowledge this burden to their credit, and so in the final rule, they changed the rollout timeline and allowed organizations to phase in their and have time to prepare to get certified. But they didn't change the actual requirement. They just gave a longer timeline and longer runway to get there. A second challenge of implementing CMMC is just scoping mistakes. This is the single most common and most costly error that the certifiers are seeing. Just people overscoping, seeing that, not looking at the full scope of the CUI boundary, and so that inflates the cost. Underscoping is another challenge. Just gets you an outright failed assessment. You didn't take into account all the systems that the CUI data is being held into. So the thing to take note here is just spending a lot of time or serious time on your boundaries and making sure you get that boundary, the system boundaries of where that data is being kept in, clear, so that you know exactly what CMMC controls need to be focused on. A third challenge is documentation, not necessarily in actually implementing the controls, but just documenting and showing how you're meeting those controls. Assessors report turning away roughly half of their clients purely on readiness grounds. The organizations they're seeing aren't ready and they're not showing me the documentation. Fourth, subcontractor flow down. These requirements cascade through every tier of the supply chain. So regardless of the size of your organization, if you're a small business supporting a large prime, there's no relief, there's no way around it just because you're a small subcontractor. You're held to the same standard. Let's take a look at the guidance and the source of truth behind CMMC. There's a lot of resources out there, and they're good. Some are good, some are not, but I want to draw you to the source, the actual truth. So this slide lists them. There's 32 CFR Part 170, as we mentioned earlier. This is the CMMC program rule itself. This rule defines the 3 levels we talked about. It has the assessment requirements, the scoring, and the plan of action and milestone rules. DFARS 252, 204, 721 is the contract clause that actually pulls CMMC into a real solicitation or an award. And then there's the technical meat, NIST Special Publication 800-171 Revision 2. This one has 110 requirements across 14 control families. NIST Special Publication 800-171 is the companion assessment guide. And this is literally the script an assessor uses to check and to validate your evidence. So it's worth looking at and reading exactly what you're going to be tested against and some examples of how you can meet those security controls and how you can show that you're meeting them. What I mentioned with 800-171 Rev 2, that Rev 3 is actually the current version that's out there for NIST Special Publication 800-171. However, CMMC Level 2 is mapping to Revision 2, not Revision 3. So I want to make sure you're looking at Revision 2 in regards to CMMC. 800-172, the last one on this list here, provides the enhanced requirements behind Level 3. So again, for that's for the advanced persistent threats. If you have information at a higher level that you're processing and holding, 800-172 would be applicable for you at the Level 3 of the CMMC. So these are some source documents. Highly encourage you to read them, get familiar with them. But I wanted to walk you through a security control for 800-171, just to make it more applicable, less abstract. 800-171 groups its 110 security requirements into 14 families. They're listed on this slide here. They're numbered 3.1 through 3.14. And each family covers a different slice of a security program. For example, who can access what, how you train people, how you log and audit activity, and how you configure systems and so forth. But even though there's 14 families, 3 of them do a lot of the heavy lifting, and those are the controls that are listed in blue on this slide. Access control has 22 requirements on its own. So that's about 1/5 of the entire standard. And it covers everything from basic login rules, to remote access and information flow, identification and authentication, has 11 on contrast. So access control has 22, but then the identification and authentication control family has 11. And that's where the example that we're going to go deeper on, comes from. And then in contrast with systems and communication protection control family, they have 16 requirements. So together, all 3 of these main heavy lifters have half of the standard, nearly half of the standard, and nearly half of the security controls. On the flip side, there's some control families that have very few. So personnel security only has 2 requirements, and incident response has 3. But don't mistake small for unimportant. Assessors are saying that smaller families often generate findings disproportionate to their size, simply because organizations treat them as an administrative afterthought rather than a serious security control. So as I mentioned, we're going to drill deeper into identification and authentication, a security control that comes direct, one of the 16 security controls that comes from there. Multi-factor authentication, and it follows the same numbering, so 3.5, but now we have 0.3 and so forth. You'd have 0.1, 0.2, 0.3. But the third one under this control family is multi-factor authentication. And this one, quoted directly from the document, SP 800-171, says, use multi-factor authentication for local and network access to privileged accounts and for network access to non-privileged accounts. So let's unpack that sentence because the wording actually matters. If you're a privileged user, so for instance, an admin, you need multi-factor authentication everywhere. So logging in locally at the machine, logging in over the network as well. However, if you're a regular user, this specific control only requires multi-factor authentication for network access. So a purely local login at your own desk it isn't covered by this particular requirement. That would be covered somewhere else. But one part that I really want you to consider and walk away with is this is reportedly the second most common failed control in DIBCAC assessments. And the reason is almost always the same. The company turns on multi-factor authentication for their cloud logins, such as Microsoft 365, and they think they're done. But that only satisfies the first part, the network access requirement. And often people forget that the local admin account on a laptop or a server or a network switch also needs multi-factor authentication under the same control. Okay, so now that we've kind of covered what typical security control is, or one of the controls are, and where people get wrong, let's talk about how you'd show an assessor that you've implemented this security control. So on the network side, you could enforce multi-factor authentication through a conditional access in Entra ID for every Microsoft 365, VPN, and remote login. Everyone that handles network access for everyone, whether it's privileged or not. On the local side, you could turn on something like Windows Hello for Business or a dedicated privilege access management tool so that local admin logins on workstation and servers also require that second factor. You'd also want to maintained inventory of exactly which accounts are privileged, so you know precisely where the local coverage needs to apply. Now on the evidence side, and this is the part again where people underestimate, it's not just enough to say we have multi-factor authentication. You know, you're not just checking a box and say, yes, we did it. You'd want to give an assessor a screenshot or an export of the actual conditional access policy, or maybe a multi-factor authentication registration report showing that every user is actually enrolled, not just eligible, but you're showing that they're enrolled in multi-factor authentication. Another option would be to simply demonstrate during an audit, show the auditor, have someone log into a local admin account on camera, and you watch that second factor prompt appear. So this is a perfect example of something we've already talked about back in the challenges section, that documentation, not just implementation, is often the gap in a CMMC assessment. So the good news is the technical fix here isn't especially hard or expensive. Just thinking through of how to prove it, you know, being thorough and clear of how you are implementing these controls, so that the assessor has no doubt and can see that you're meeting them. Wanted to look at a few more resources, not just the documents themselves, but some websites and some resources out there on CMMC. Very helpful. These are authoritative sites, not just random ones that are out there. So if you bookmark one page after today, make sure it's the Department of War's CIO's CMMC Hub. This is the official source for CMMC. They have a facts page where people have answered questions, frequently asked questions, assessment guides, alignment documents, and it gets updated as real questions come in from the field. There's also a site that has on the CMMC site that has links to all the source documents that we referenced earlier and many more. The second site I want to highlight is the C3PAO Cyber AB Marketplace. So cyberab.org listed there. This is the organization that certifies the C3PAOs. So if you ever need to verify that a C3PAO is actually authorized to conduct your CMMC assessment, go to this site. It's the Cyber AB Marketplace, and look up their name, see if they're listed there. And given the assessor shortage that we talked about, it's worth double checking rather than taking a firm's word for it. And also the number of C3PAOs that are authorized to assess is growing. So this is the site that you look at the updates. Kind of a side note here, just you hear me talk about the Department of Defense, Department of War. Just wanted to mention that the Department of Defense was officially renamed the Department of War in 2025. So when you hear both, they're both official, mean the same thing. So just don't let that trip you up in your search for resources. For anyone tracking your own assessor credentials, CCP or CCA, the lead CCA as of April 2026 is ISACA, and it's the organization that's administering those certifications. Mentioned also the third bullet here is that CMMC's alignment to the NIST standards. You can take a look at 800-171, 800-172 line by line. I'm just going to the NIST site up there, the NIST website. And all of these are Google, like they're publicly available, easy to find. Just put it in Google. Let's briefly talk about eMASS. eMASS stands for the Enterprise Mission Assurance Support Service. And this is the Department of Defense's system of record for documenting how a system's security controls are actually implemented. It's also the place where supporting evidence goes. And one relationship worth remembering is that eMASS holds the underlying security package. And SPURS is the contracting facing score and status that a contracting officer actually checks before awarding a contract. So they're two separate systems, but both work together within CMMC. One process detail that can be useful is that the C3PAOs have to upload their final assessment packages into eMASS as well, and they have 20 business days of the final findings briefing. So that's just a real clock worth knowing if you're the one being assessed. And so again, eMASS is used both by the organizations that are submitting the evidence, and it's used by the assessors to view the evidence and to provide their final assessment package. So it's just the communication hub, the communication tool. And eMASS is actually a perfect bridge to our next topic of how CMMC correlates with the risk management framework process, RMF, because the risk management framework also uses eMASS, and eMASS initially was implemented for risk management framework. So if anyone who's listening to this has been involved in risk management framework, you're familiar with these terms, but for those of you who are not, I wanted to give you kind of a rundown of what RMF is and then how that translates to CMMC. So an authority to operate is the end goal of risk management framework. That is saying that your system is securely running and can securely protect data. And so where within CMMC, the end goal really is to be secure, right? But the end certification of saying, yes, you've passed is getting a CMMC certificate. So both are kind of a formal, yes, you're cleared, but they're just granted for different things. An authorizing official within RMF is the organization, or is the position that decides for risk management framework if the system is securely running and can grant the ATO, where a commercial assessor decides for the CMMC. And that commercial assessor in CMMC is often a C3PAO, or it would be a DIBCAC if you're working under level 3. Within risk management framework, continuous monitoring doesn't really have an expiration date. CMMC is a point in time. So it's valid for 3 years with an annual affirmation in between. Your system security plan is literally the same type of document in both risk management framework and in CMMC. It's just reviewed for different purposes. Also wanted to mention that the control catalogs share similar lineage. So NIST Special Publication 853 is the publication and the security controls that the risk management framework is working under and the security controls that they're implementing. But 800-171 for CMMC is essentially the full catalog of 853. It's just a narrower slice carved out specifically for CUI. So let me clarify, I said that poorly. 853 is the full catalog. That's all the security controls. But 800-171 pulls from 853, uses the same language, and has a subset of 853, specifically looking just at protecting CUI, and the security controls for 871 is specifically what CMMC level 2 is using. eMASS is genuinely the same system, under both processes, as we mentioned. You're going to have the biggest structural difference is just that the risk management framework authorizes one system where CMMC is certifying the company, looking at the entire company and showing that the company's infrastructure and how they're handling data is secure. So that's really the core of it. It's the same underlying goal of proving protection instead of just claiming it. It's just applied to a different unit of assessment. So, and if you're not familiar with risk management framework, that's fine too. Just wanted to, these terms are terms around the same security ecosystem, especially under the same publications or using similar security controls that can correlate easily to understanding of how the two systems, the security controls, are being implemented. Okay, so with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up the training, but thank you so much for joining today's. If you're expecting a CEU certificate, how you would request it is just go to darkzebra.com, purchase a certificate, and with that, you will get both a certificate validating that you attended that you can use to submit for your CEU for whatever organization that you got your certificate from. Security Plus is CompTIA. With that, you'll also get a copy of these slides, a PDF copy that will allow you to show what was covered in this training, so you can use that to submit along with your attendance certification. But it's also just a resource for you to have to refer back to look at as far as, so we covered a lot of content, and having it in written form can be helpful. You can also purchase just the slides directly. If you don't need the attendance certificate, that's okay. You can get the attendance certificate and the slides just for your own use. But again, thank you for attending. I'll show you quickly how this training mapped to the Security Plus security controls. So this is something that you can have just to clarify that this is applicable for Security Plus CEU. Okay, go ahead and drop your questions in if you have any, but I'm going to stop the recording and appreciate you coming. Hope to see you at our next training. We do trainings multiple times a month, and again, darkzebra.com will list the next trainings. Have a great day.